10 years. It has been 10 years since the release of Final Fantasy XIV, A Realm Reborn, and as the Endwalker expansion draws to a close, Dawn Trail looms on the horizon, the Hydaelyn and Zodiark tale has concluded, and the game's 10th anniversary having passed, there's no more perfect time to sit down and rank the game's content. So this is the first of a couple different ranking projects, where I'm not just gonna off-the-cuff these into a tier list and call it a day. No, I've sat down with way too much time on my hands, replayed all of these over the last couple months, and scored them, sorted them, and put together this PowerPoint. Yes, really PowerPoint, because I'm not a professional at this. This particular ranking is getting split into 3 videos because I'm going to want some breaks in between, and like, I don't know, that just makes it easier for me to record. That's how much of an amateur I am. And I did record this live. This is all being recorded in one take, so if you hear me like responding to somebody, that's why. I prepped this in LibreOffice. It's not going to be fancy or proper as a display. It's just a gallery of some screenshots with some information and my vocal commentary. Again, I'm not a professional. Please do not expect me to be. So, before we begin, here's some very quick notes about this project, because we have a lot to cover. There will be spoilers. Let's be clear about that up front. Dungeons sometimes contain major showdowns with antagonists, exist in pretty spoilery spaces or concepts, or are basically the playable representation of major events, and I will sometimes be mentioning that. I'll try to avoid actually spoiling the how, or plot stuff outside of the dungeons themselves, so if you're unfamiliar with the game, I hope these whet your appetite, but if you really care about spoilers, maybe just, like, go finish up 6.5 first. This list does cover every dungeon in the Duty Finder's dungeon tabs. That means it will not include Variant, Deep, Treasure Map, Criterion, or Criterion Savage dungeons. Honestly, all of those aim for such different design objectives that it's hard to rank them against the standard dungeon structure. It also does not include the 4-man trials. Those will be included when I do a trial ranking video. Also, to paraphrase MMORPG personality Druff Scythe Hayes, we cannot play through our memories of the game. What that means in this context is that all the dungeons are ranked as you will likely experience them today. As in 6.5 with 6.5's balance, with other random players in the Duty Finder, not every dungeon has duty support, and this means after any changes that have been made to the dungeons throughout the ages. I might mention changes, like the time they removed Left B from a dungeon and completely neutered a boss, but what I am actually ranking is the dungeon as it is currently existing and the experience you will have in it now. I'm not holding low level against a dungeon. I know sometimes dungeons are low enough level that your limited kit adds a degree of boredom for many of them, but, like, the cutoff point for where that stops being a problem changes per player and per job. I'm not penalizing every sub-80 dungeon just because I was on Reaper for it. You know what I mean? Trust me, low-level dungeons have enough stumbling blocks as is. They don't need that. Finally, even at this point, there's dungeons I'd want to move around or disagree with how they placed, but I decided on a system and stuck with it, and here's the results. If you disagree with where I valued things or where things placed, like, by all means feel free to tell me, like, either on Twitch Live or, like, on the YouTube recording of this in the comments. Oh god, I just shelled from my comments section. But I legitimately want to hear. Part of why I'm making this video is that I was sad I couldn't find more videos about this exact sort of thing. Like, go record yourself slapping them into a tier list if you disagree, and send me the links, because I legitimately want to know. Okay, cool. Let's discuss the scoring really quick. I came up with 7 categories, each of which can score anywhere from 0 to 5 points, scored against my expectation of dungeons in 14. Basically, 0 is just hecking nothing. There's very little I can command. 1 is, I can maybe find something good about it, but I probably still don't think it's good. 2 is, it's fine, I guess. It's the average on the sort of shrug side of things, and 3 is average on the side of, yeah, no, that's good. 4 is where a dungeon starts to really show its stuff, and 5, of course, is like, 5 is what I'd like every dungeon piece to be at. This results in a total score that theoretically should be between 0 and 35, but the lowest scoring dungeon on here actually scored negatively, and the highest scoring dungeon scored more than a 35. We'll get to why in a moment. These categories, in short, trash covers the filler content in between pulls. 14 does not do great and interesting trash, admittedly, but there is still a big gap between the absolute most boring possible trash pulls and what some of the dungeons at least attempt to do. So this is like environmental hazards, pull mechanics, mini-bosses, reinforcements. The more there would be to talk about in a dungeon on that front, the higher it scores here. Bosses. Each of the 3 bosses gets scored individually as their highlights of the dungeon experience. I don't expect much out of a dungeon boss. They're not trials. So this is on a scale from 0 to 5 of what I expect of 14's dungeon bosses. Dungeon bosses scoring low are usually just like striking dummies. They ultimately don't really do anything to you. Notably, I expect more out of the final boss of a dungeon compared to the others, so if a fight might have scored a 3 if it were the first or second boss, it'll probably only get like a 2 as the final boss. Also, this is from a perspective of a player with 10 years of experience. I meant mention if I like bosses conceptually, but mostly the act of playing them matters much more to me for scoring. Visuals. So, moving away from the pure gameplay scores, this is how cool of an environment the dungeon is. Sometimes the actual enemy visuals get factored in, but mostly it's like the look, the art direction, the like level of visual detailing and stuff. I'm not much for like hard texture detail level stuff, so this is kind of just how cool I think the dungeon is to look at. Audio. How bangers the music, primarily. Yes, this means most launch A Realm Reborn dungeons are defaulted down to 0 because they have their individual tracks for about a minute and then just drop it entirely for regular enemy encounter music. Unique boss tracks or voice acting also help boost a dungeon's audio. On occasion, I note the sound effects, but mostly it was a penalty on those rare occasions because it's like an annoying alarm blaring or something like that. Finally, identity is like theme, vibe, uniqueness, memorability. It's just sort of that, like, I don't know, it's that extra cohesion factor that is about how cool of a place the dungeon and the experience is as a whole. This is also where things like extra lore in the dungeon and stuff comes into factor here. Finally, I do think it's worth evaluating each dungeon in relation to their peers, so I have divided the 90 dungeons into 6 different eras. Launch A Realm Reborn, 2.X, Heavensward, Stormblood, Shadowbringers, and Endwalker. I have separated Launch ARR and 2.X because combined they are literally twice as large as any other set of dungeons in the game. And it felt fair to contrast the initial development rush of ARR with once they started having time afterwards to build on what they had started. We are ranking all of these dungeons against all of these other dungeons, but within each of these eras, I have picked one dungeon to be a best of category in each era and one to be a worst of category in each era. For instance, a dungeon might have best trash of A Realm Reborn or worst identity of Heavensward. Each of these adds a +1 or a -1 to their final score because they do deserve to be recognized for their achievements or flaws of their time. These merits and demerits also help me sort out the many tiebreakers that I had to do, but when 2 dungeons had the same scores, I just kind of had to make a decision. So yeah. Stellar Stairs said, I wish I knew 14. You know what? This could be fun if you don't know 14, just to take in all the sites and stuff that we're going to be in and just enjoy that. Identity, the vibe check. How excited are you when you get it in a roulette? In a way, yeah. It's just kind of like how much the place pops and is a thing. Okay. Are you ready? All of that preamble out of the way. 10 minutes into this, let's finally begin ranking these. I'm curious what people thought would gonna rank as the worst dungeon in Final Fantasy XIV, who know it, because without a single doubt in my mind, number 90... the Tamtara Deepcroft. Oh, buddy. Okay. Okay. I found one nice thing to say first, and it's that I like the way the dungeon is laid out, such that you can kind of see the whole thing as you spiral downwards towards the center of it. And that's a neat touch no other dungeon has. And that said, let me tear into this sucker. How is this acceptable? In the last 10 years, there's been 2 passes to improve the ARR experience. And while Tamtara used to have competition for worst in the game, those competitors got changes that made them better. Tamtara is still just a pile of trash, both figuratively and literally. Like, it's trash pulls after trash pulls, with a bonus round of boss fights that are actually just trash pulls that summon a slightly bigger trash mob at the end of it. Whoa! And the one actual boss at the end has a gimmick of, get this, summoning more trash. It's almost impressive that this place doesn't take home more Worst of awards, but it was in contention for almost every single one. Yet the complete lack of second boss in any capacity earns it 1 for that. The trash just being the blandish garbage without a single interesting decision, and there being so much of it, it earns that 1. And there's, like, nothing else of value here. Which is how the Tamtara Deepcroft manages to score a whopping -1 total. I genuinely think this dungeon deserves this negative score. It is the game's second dungeon, and I would not blame a single player who quit after this one, because, seriously, if this is how the game is trying to hook you, would it? If some Square community manager is somehow watching this video, please relay to the team my sincerest desire that they do absolutely anything to make this dungeon not suck. And now to hate a dungeon slightly less with 89. Halatali. It's a former Colosseum that was abandoned and overrun by monsters. How do you make Halatali boring? Well, they sure found a way. The visuals are boring. The use of the concept is almost non-existent. The bosses are super boring and feel like downgrades of concepts that you've already seen in the mere 3 prior dungeons. Yeah, like, I especially dislike Tengata, the final boss, who somehow is less fun than the striking dummy he is. He's not even a boss who earns his Worst of ARR award through being aggravatingly bad. He's just intensely boring because you're so incentivized to just ignore so much. And, oh, trust me, the Thunderclap Reaver tests my patience too, but there's so much competition for garbage bosses that I'm okay with Halatali just splitting these honors of worst bosses with a couple others. It's fitting. The sole thing propping Halatali out of the negative score is that its trash does have wandering foes, a little bit of danger, and the cute little pull the winch to win a random prize bit. Though I almost considered that a negative, because every time you get lightning sprites, your prize is being here longer. So, yeah. Lacking more or less anything to get excited about, Halatali's a dud. It is an entirely optional dungeon, if I remember right. And were I to start again, I might legitimately choose to skip it so I don't get it in my roulettes. Flux said, I would have put this worse. I hate the pacing here. At least you can kind of run through Tam for a quickish end. You can at least have the advantage in Halatali of skipping a little bit of the trash. Also, I'm now realizing its final score is actually a 2 as I look at this math. But can't skip it if you want to rank up your Grand Company. Oh god, you're right. Why did you have to remind me of this? Also, I forgot to change its number. It is actually 89. It says 90 on there. Be ready for me to make mistakes like that all over the place. I am not a professional, ladies and gentlemen. Anyway, number 88. The Copperbell Mines, hard. The hard modes of FF14 are not just the same dungeon, but slightly harder. They're supposed to be sequels, return trips with new foes and bosses, visual updates, kinda new dungeons just in old locations. Unfortunately, Copperbell Hard is a demonstration of the worst of that idea. The darker lighting and absolute lack of visual changes to one of the already more boring settings of ARR made for 2.x's least interesting dungeon visual. It feels like any points it would have had to its name were claimed by the original, and this just made it worse. Now, on the music front, no 2.x dungeon is ever silent, so you'll almost be never seeing zeros here in anything from 2.x onwards, but while I like the Dark's Embrace and the way it shifts dynamically into its battle version, it feels mismatched for almost every single dungeon it's used in, so it's not getting a high score. It doesn't help that the bosses are best described as chaotic and then suddenly over, except Biggie, for whom your party's success hinges on one player doing the only mechanic that matters, which is not fun even if it's interesting. The trash is also super basic, and if there's one thing ARR does have going for it, it's rarely actually having completely boring trash. And Copperbell's like the worst in 2.x. Even if it didn't have 3 entire major demerits to its name, Copperbell Hard wouldn't be good, but this place is especially bad because 2.1 was the start of content getting better, and this just wasn't it. This was a patch 2.1 dungeon. It was important to follow up a successful launch with a lot of content, and so quantity over quality probably was the correct decision to make. But I do think there's a reason they steadily reduced the hard mode dungeon quantity over time, because as you'll see, I think a number are just worse than their originals. Oh, my song. I did like breaking out with the miners, though. It tried something, yeah. But not my fave. Anyway, 87 is a dungeon people were probably expecting to have seen already. The Thousand Maws of Totorak. I mentioned there were competitors for Tamtara as the worst historical dungeon in the game, but they got reworked to escape it. Thousand Yawns barely escaped, but it did. First off, I have to talk about the garbage bosses. Well, actually, okay, Graphius gets like a pass. He scores a 0 overall because he's still a weak boss, but he's not the worst thing. But I take a specific issue with the first 2 bosses, who are once again nearly identical, who try to teach healers how to use Asuna by immediately reapplying the status effects that you are cleansing. That is the opposite of teaching. That is dissuading people from doing it. Easily the worst boss, like one of the worst dungeon bosses in the entire game, and I considered giving it both penalties for repeating that boss fight, but splitting those awards with Tamtara felt right. Beyond that, the rework of Thousand Mod focused on instead rebuilding the dungeon itself. The little web gates and the, like, quote-unquote exploration that was really just backtracking is gone, but, like, that just kind of made things boring instead of a pain in the neck. What actually saved Totorak from last place was that it got a visual overhaul. The overgrown former prison now just has a whole lot more detail and is a lot more immersive as it gets choked out by webs and cocoons. It has a much greater sense of place that, like, I don't love, but it's something now. At least visually. As far as its gameplay after the rework, now it's just boring instead of the literal worst. And that's the crime it commits. It's boring. But that is an improvement. Cecil points out that they also got rid of just like a giant cutscene right before the boss at the end of it. So, that's an improvement too. Number 86. Amdapor Keep. Let's get an important point of credit out of the way first. Amdapor Keep is the first dungeon that we have reached that has actually no worst of demerit going on, so that's something. Which also says something that it's this far down because it just didn't earn many points to begin with. Now, back at launch, this dungeon was famous as a novice killer. The Demon Wall was an impossible boss, but launch was 10 years ago and Amdapor has not aged well. It's got a boring look, it's got the ARR music curse, and there's not a whole lot unique in presentation or identity to it. And its bosses? Well, the first was always just a tank and spank, no matter how cute the golem advancing was, and the last, I mean, final boss standards have advanced a lot. Plus, power creep has neutered most of these fights. Even the once glorious demon wall, like, people have learned how to move out of AoEs, and even if it still summoned the bees from back in the day, that wouldn't be a problem anymore. The solitary thing propping Amdapor up these days is its variety of trash. Summoners you can stun and kill before they finish summoning more, ambush packs jumping out of statues, wandering mobs, the succubi harassing you while you're not in combat. Even if none of that is super notable, it's all trying, and I appreciate that. But when the best part of your dungeon is the trash, yeah. Amdapor is far from the only early dungeon to share this fate, but, like, it lacks in a lot of areas. Obear asks, it summoned bees. Yes. At a certain point in Demon Wall's old rotation, it would summon 2 adds that were basically like, they added extra AoEs and extra chaos to the fight. And you used to legitimately use a limit break to get rid of them quickly, because nobody was good at the game back then. Demon Brick has got to be worth a bonus point. Demon Brick is a fantastic minion, I will give him that. Next, 85. The Smile Darkhold, whose first name I will now proceed to never attempt to pronounce again, is... Listen, we're probably all on the same page here. The first thing you thought of was the super trash pull in the first leg. It used to be a fastest leveling method before EXP was reassigned to the bosses, specifically to stop that. And that is fun. In fact, assuming you like a little spice and variety, Smile has some excellent trash pulls. I just said it, just casually in the script. It has our first 5 out of 5 in a category, in fact, for its trash. There's the first pull with the defense buffs to run into, there's the frogs, the exploding crystals, the time locks. Like, Darkhold is doing its damnedest to be interesting throughout on its trash. Not everything may necessarily be fast or to everyone's taste, but it is trying. As for the bosses, All-Seeing Eye and Batrawl are passable fights, especially for the ARR standard. Batrawl especially with his surprisingly spicy damage. I do wish the second boss had that same level of care, but he's just a striking dummy. But what drags Darkhold down this far is its presentation. In the lore, this place is an Ishgardian nobility's oubliette. You'd be forgiven for never noticing, because this place is the single blandest cave to have ever caved in 14, and there's a lot of caves in 14. It has nothing interesting going on with it in environmental design that makes it memorable as a place, so it gets 2 worst of awards. When the literal reason that people remember you is for your first trash pull, that's kind of a forgettable dungeon. The only dungeon I legit got lost in the first time with that big open room in the Toads, Flux says. Yeah, you can't get lost in it anymore. They took out the whole down the cliff area that nobody ever had any reason to go to. Except the pretty crystals, but I'm a rock host, says Chana. There's pretty crystals in so many dungeons, I can't credit Zamael with that. Okay, 84. The Copper Bell Mines. We just discussed the revisit of this. Is the original OLED special? Well, no, it's an 84th. But while it used to be another competitor for worst in the game, Copper Bell has escaped that fate thanks to the update giving it actual bosses. Like, in the past you had 2 complete sleepers and, like, a fight where one player just did the fight for you. Now, each of the bosses spooks players with big AoEs that are patterns that actually are kind of relevant to modern fight design. You know, Kados teaches you successive attacks, the final boss teaches you in and outs. Like, they're not intense, they're not special by modern standards, but I respect that as part of the tutorial dungeons of the game now. So, there's that. And that was Copper Bell's weakness originally, was garbage bosses. The rest is still kinda eh. Like, you get a little bit of spicy mobs in self-destructing bombs and the ambushes. The mine aesthetic isn't great, but it's a little bit detailed and fleshed out. You get some visual progression as you head deeper into the caverns. Would I be happy to see Copperbell in a roulette? No, it's dry and brain dead for a veteran. But of the 3 tutorial dungeons, I think it functions well as part of that tutorial, and I respect it for that. Most importantly, like, the entire team doesn't just sit around during most of the boss fights. Just try to remember that the lore for this dungeon is that we're suppressing a slave uprising. I'm pretty sure that's on the lore team's soft retconned by just never mentioning it again list. Flux says, I miss being able to make a drink during the Ad Gauntlet boss fight. Yeah. Next up, 83. This pick might be a little bit spicy. Conceptually, the first vigil that we get is a frozen castle overrun by dragons. Regrettably, I think it only gives flashes of living up to that concept in its execution, and frozen castle and dragons are themes we're going to be revisiting on this list, and so the Stone Vigil has aged a bit. But it is trying. By the time you reach the Stone Vigil in ARR, you've also gotten enough experience for the game to start showing its teeth more, so the Vigil's able to avoid 0 in most of its gameplay scores. It's trash as some bite, you have Chudo Yudo's Unmarked Huge Cleave, Koshei's introduction to moving hazards, and of course Isgabin's Baby's first dive bombs. That's all more advanced than the previous mandatory duties, and they assure you're at least not completely asleep at the wheel, which is a step up for ARR dungeons. Stone Vigil is like okay with fresh eyes, maybe even exciting as a new player still, but kinda dated for veterans, and I know many players would argue it does its theme much better than I have given it credit for. Frankly, its only major black spot to me is the audio. I think its unique theme is the worst in ARR, so, like, it barely takes home the penalty in that category. Like, I know Stone Vigil for many players is actually weirdly a favorite just because it is the dragon dungeon of ARR, but that doesn't really sell it for me, sorry. Chana said, the only dungeon I ever rage quit on White Mage when I was first learning to heal. I can understand that. My first time here, I spent 2 hours in queue as a DPS, because this was before duty roulettes, and then we didn't finish. But, so far, we've been exclusively railing on A Realm Reborn's dungeon. Before we even leave the worst 10, it's time to jump into the expansions. 82 is nobody's favorite dungeon. Never reap. More like never run, am I right? Level cap at each expansion's launch comes with 2 expert dungeons, and I don't know if there's ever been a greater disparity between the pair than this and Fractal Continuum. Now, I will say some nice things first. Since we're in Heaven's Ward, we're now at unique music and better visual fidelity. And Never Reap is okay at the audio part. Unfortunately, even if the dungeon looks good, it also almost entirely looks like more of the Sea of Clouds, which is nice, but it means that this place has little that it calls its own, and wins it 2 demerits because of the visual and lack of identity, which were things that went way up in Heaven's Ward. Does it get better on a combat front? I mean, I like the trash here. There's the Cyclones, there's the bees. God, I love the bees in dungeons. The audacity of giving mobs just an enrage that just destroys your tank. And the final like even has the cute little water spouts. It's fun. But the bosses are what really gives Never Reap its reputation. Like, wasting your time is the overwhelming theme here. Tons of invulnerability, tons of times where you have to disengage to deal with things, tons of times where you are just not playing the game. Like, Nunyanek disappearing into the fog is fun for absolutely nobody. Like, he's my pick for worst first boss of Heaven's Ward. And maybe one of the worst first bosses in the whole game. And that's how Never Reap falls so far from the sky. 3 separate demerits for completely failing the new standards that Heaven's Ward would set, and just not being fun. Unless you get a party like I had when I had to revisit it here. There was a lot of deaths and a tank who did not understand that they were, in fact, the problem. Lots of bees, lots of bees, lots of bees. I love the bees. Yep. 81. Brayflux's long stop hard. Once again, I am left talking about the revision of a dungeon before its original, which makes it hard to explain what it messed up. Taking the once pretty jungles of the long stop and just littering them with the wreckage of a war zone, the hard version attempts to aim for increased intensity. You get bombarded in the first by cannons, have to rescue goblins in the second part, and it just doesn't really click and work together for me. It's kinda just ugly. The combat aspects are alright. I like the way the second boss covers the arena in oil, and the longer you let him go without letting him detonate it, the less safe room you have. But you could literally kill him before he detonates it at this point. The Gob Machine at the end is a pretty impressive boss for its, release in terms of complexity and the difference of its mechanics, and the whole knocking bombs away from you fun. But while it does feel great to skip the final phase with a well-timed limit break, it also kind of feels awful to know that you could miss it and have to spend an extra minute there. None of those are too strong in the grand scheme of things, but the hard long stop's real weakness is in its sense of identity. It doesn't have the nature walk appeal of the original long stop, and suffice to say, fights with goblin tech became way more common in the next expansion with the Alexander series, and thus have been done way better too. The place just feels buddy to me. And as a result, I can't say I love any aspect of it nearly as much as the original. No love for the cheese war? No, not really. Okay, that was the bottom 10. Here's number 80. The Wanderer's Palace. Few enemies will strike fear into the hearts of a Final Fantasy veteran like a Tonberry does. The way they slowly advance on your party until their little knives do obscene amounts of damage. It's the classic DPS race phrased as an enemy, so of course it's perfect for an MMORPG. And 14 certainly tried. The palace is a rather quaint-looking area, but in each leg you'll be steadily pursued by a massive Tonberry stalker. You cannot fight him, but his stab will still take off significant chunks of your HP if he catches up, so you're always fleeing down hallways of trash or evading them in mazes. Or you used to. Obviously, it's really easy to burn down the trash fast enough these days, and even in the maze, you could have two of them pile on you, and your healer can just heal you from it. This place has not survived overgearing well, and that extends to its bosses too. I don't even remember what the gimmicks of the first two bosses in this place are, because they just die too fast to do anything anymore. And similarly, the whole idea of the Tonberry King was that the best way to beat him was to rush him down and avoid killing his ads for as long as possible, and now that's effortless. That said, even if it no longer achieves on a gameplay front, the chase aspect of the palace is still unique and helps it achieve a solid identity. The visuals are okay too, and even if the music gets cut out, I actually really like the opening theme to this dungeon. Regrettably, this palace was just doomed to overgearing and power creep, destroying it, and has suffered for it. Oh My Song said, another experiment that didn't work, but I respect it. Yeah, I wish that pressure could have stuck around. For number 79, it's time to name the worst of another expansion. And surprise, it's not the next one on the list. Coming in an extremely embarrassing place, it's... Malika's Well. Now listen, Shadowbringers has some incredible dungeons. You're not going to see most Shadowbringers dungeons for a while on this list. But that's also kind of why Malika's Well ends up down here. There's a seeming consensus that the well just isn't that memorable or impactful. The Copperbell mines of an alternate universe little fails to excite. It opts for its It opts for an oppressive atmosphere in its music that is unique, but doesn't match how the entire dungeon is presented to you. Of course, this isn't Copperbelt or actually decently solid boss fights. The Armadillo has decent amounts of pressure in its AoEs, and the Amphibious Talos really gets you moving with its giant sweep attacks. And then, of course, at the end we have Storge, who is a super memorable design, going full biblically accurate angel. But you realize after fighting it a couple times that it basically only has 2 attacks on repeats, and that's not much, especially for how late in the game this happens. Like, similarly, the Mind thematic is being done alright in the well, and the progression into an ether-corrupted area is neat, but it's not really pulling enough weight. Like, Malika's Well is technically an okay dungeon that I don't hate running. It is much better than many other dungeons you'll see soon. The problem is that it's just okay in an expansion where many players would argue dungeon quality was at its highest. It earns the worst of Shadowbringer's placements in 4 different categories, and even its remaining categories don't exactly inspire high scores either, which drags Malika's Well all the way down here for me. Bonus demerits for the gear set? I mean, isn't this the place that has the, like, dwarven masks? I could be wrong, though. Actually, yeah, why is the second boss a total comedy boss for such a serious stretch of the game? Dungeon bosses, yeah. Yeah, I was surprised it fell this low. Like, even I was kind of surprised at how it turned out, but I looked at everything and I'm like, yeah, kinda. On probably a less controversial note, here's level 78, number 78. Holotolly Hard. At least it's better than the original. The Colosseum may have been reopened for challenge, but other than a couple of guiding NPCs, you won't really feel much of a difference. It still has a pretty boring aesthetic. It still doesn't really lean too hard into the Colosseum feel, and the music, I mean, okay, it does have its own unique music track, but you'll probably be sick of hearing it even by the time I'm done this section, because it's my least favorite in 2.x. Did the combat get better? Yeah, but not by a huge margin. I do like catching the trash under the wrecking balls to soften them up, but the remainder of the dungeon is pretty flat and forcibly slow-paced. As for your bosses, each one has some fun little trick. Pirakmon is the first giant enemy you will see in here that comes with the extra little mammoth. There's the Katoblapaz, where you need to deliberately blind yourself to avoid its gaze. And in the end, we almost get a Colosseum feel with taking on a rush of champions, and then an FF14 cameo mob who has a gimmick that's basically disable a couple people, which is always walking a thin line for how fun that is. But is any of this all that special? No. It helps ascend Holotolly, placing a little better in almost every single area. We have gone from a score of like a couple points to 10 here. And it is a better hard mode than its original, which is a first for the hard modes on this list. But I feel like most players will have forgotten the majority of what goes on here, and for good reason. It doesn't really leave an impact. Flex said, how to talk to NPCs hard. Yep. It makes a better stage for other quests, trying to point out. Yeah, there's a great, like, instance in the quest in Heavensward that uses this place that just does it way better. Cecil says, it's just drums. The music is just drums. I love tracks that are just drums, but they have to have a lot more variety than just that. 77. Sestasha. Bet you're surprised it survived this long, but I think it's easily the best of the 3 opening dungeons. As the game's very first dungeon, Sestasha is certainly missing some things. Like, yes, it's completely lacking interesting boss fights. Each of them are striking dummies, but none of them are so bad in some way as to end up at a worst. But if it isn't the boss fights, what holds Sestasha up? Well, honestly, it's one of the more visually involved dungeons in A Realm Reborn. You have the gorgeous coral formations in the first area, then you have the whole pirate base that you walk through and come out on the docks of. Like, it's more transformative and feels like an actual place. And it's trying some interesting stuff on the trash front. Like, yeah, obviously we have the infamously invincible clams, but, like, even just in the rest of it, you have a lot of freedom to skip things if you know what to pull and what not to, and I kind of like that. I think it's just telling that when the ARR dungeons got a second pass for duty support, Sastasha didn't really need to be changed beyond the most minor of tweaks. It's a good introductory dungeon with a cool look to it, and that's, like, a cool look alone can get it out of the bottom of the list. Kuji said, opinions on the colored coral puzzle? It's really basic and you can actually skip it because all you get is like a 15-second poison dot, but like, I like that they tried. Shauna said, it's visually engaging and I really love the background NPCs that don't interact with the players. Yeah, absolutely. The captain likes his dungeon simple. 76. Hawkeye Manor, specifically hard mode. The one place in the game where this music track feels like it fits. Unfortunately, it's another hard mode dungeon that places below its original. It does make some gameplay improvements. It has less rewardless side tangents to get cut up on, and the trash is more aggressive, and I like the hallway pull with the giant sweeping laser beams and the ambush stuff coming out at you. Like, it's okay. The bosses are... well, I'd like to call them better, but that's difficult. I like Ash. He's a fun boss with a variety of AoEs, which is doing fine by 2-point Exa standards. But then there's, like, the Jester fight that is completely destroyed by damage, just overgearing, and the fact that his whole gimmick was reviving things, and now he barely has time to. And Halicarnassus is actually really funny. She is both easier because she can burn her down so fast and destroy her ads fast, and more lethal because if people aren't paying attention for the ads, it will kill you. That's funny, but not exactly engaging when that's the whole fight. Mostly, Hawkeye Manor Hard is burdened by the fact that the visual changes to the dungeon, in my opinion, weakened it. The lighting and the decor of this place is just messier and, like, just kind of tilted red as opposed to being what it is. It's trying to force something more cursed and actually just failing it, in my opinion. It just lost the magic somewhere along the way. Little has really stood the test of time here in being all that interesting. That hallway gives me so much operational anxiety. Yeah, no, the hallway is really good. Uh, 75. Brayflux's Long Stop. Okay, listen, I confess I have a very specific aesthetic weakness in this game as far as A Realm Reborn is concerned, and it's Eastern Lenoskia. The Jungles of Winepart is like maybe my favorite visual area in the game, and so having an entire dungeon out in those is really good. Personal bias, but it's the best looking launch A Realm Reborn dungeon to me, and gets our first Best of award on this list. And that's what props it up this high instead of a few places back, because otherwise Brayflux's Long Stop is pretty eh. It technically has 4 bosses, so I did it the favor of counting the Pelican and Trash, and it didn't help. Its Trash only gets points for being relatively open in how you pull or don't. The only interesting thing about all of its bosses currently is the way Brayflux shows up in the Drake fight, only to get marked for a tank buster and immediately do the only sensible thing, drop it on your party. Ayatar is, like, okay after his rework. You don't have to worry about the fight taking forever because you have a tank who doesn't understand the mechanic, but he's actually pretty basic now. Just very familiar in the way that he works. And even compared to previous bosses, not doing that much. Plus, ultimately, while the dungeon's pretty, its identity is it's more Eastern Lenoskia. This dungeon is propped up here just purely by the fact that I love how it looks. That's all. But, like, seriously, take a look at it. Flux said, "Ah yes, the dragon with a dumpy so big it kills the second boss in one hit." So anyway, number 74. The Stone Vigil Hard. A return trip to the dragon-infested castle. This time, theoretically, you're backed by a regiment of Ishgardian soldiers. I say theoretically because you'll only see them again for the second boss fight, and, like, put a pin in the phrase second boss fight. Given I didn't like the original much, you'd think a retread would be worse. It has even less of a sense of identity to me, but it's hard to pretend it got worse otherwise. Most of the improvements are on the gameplay front. The trash has transforming enemies you can stun, mobs with raid wides, dragons that announce their ambush with sudden AoEs, and that whole section where you have to repeatedly shoot down the dragon. It's trying. And I do have to credit Gyroveganus, the final boss of the dungeon. It completely ignores aggro, doesn't use AoE markers, and you just have to watch it to see its attacks, which would be alright on itself, but then the second one joins in and it's one of my favorite 2.x boss fights. However, for all those gameplay improvements, there's Kukafera. The boss fight is fought using cannons to do any real damage to it while NPCs distract the ads. Cool in concept. In practice, 1, 1, 1, 1, 2, 1, 1, 1. It is an actively unfun slog of a fight. And that drags Stone Vigil Hard back down to earth. But I'm fine with that. Yeah. With that boss fight being what it is, I don't think I'd want this dungeon to have placed any higher. Flux said, "Hate this guy, you really can't solo in this dungeon because of it. Unless you're a blue mage where I think you can instant kill him. I could be wrong though. God, I hope I'm wrong." 73. Hokke Manor, parentheses, normal. Beating out its hard mode by just a couple places, I feel like Hokke is the first dungeon that I hear players get excited about as a new player for what dungeons can be, and it does it pretty much entirely on its atmosphere and style. From the ominous organ track as an intro, before the ARR silence kicks in, you know what this place is going for. The demon-haunted halls, like, we're going around scrounging up keys to open up abandoned rooms, we're jumping down into its dungeons. It has a unique sense of identity, and while there's a whole lot of little dead ends to explore that just kind of waste your time, it also helps Hokke Manor feel like a mansion, a place. What did the bosses lived up to the presentation? The Claviger and the dual boss of the Jester and Steward, they're tank and spanks, and they don't do anything to spice it up. I do enjoy that the only mob you have to fight in the last leg is the butler, and that he flies off at half health to open the last door. It helps the place feel alive, like I said. Also, Amandine herself, by the way, did get reworked. I kind of miss the chaos of the original, but now she introduces gaze attacks through creatures she summons, and that makes her probably the first boss that you will fight with any slightly more involved mechanic that isn't just spelled out on the floor. But it's still not much. Hokke is the first glimpse a player gets into how cool the game's dungeons can be as a setting. That is its strength. I wish it wasn't as lacking on the gameplay front. Cecil said, "I do appreciate that they canonized the return trick." Yeah. Sage says it's his favorite ARR dungeon, and you know what? I can respect that. As far as sub-level 50 dungeons go, you can do much worse than Hokke Manor. Also, isn't this the first job qualifying dungeon? Yes, this is the first dungeon you can get into with your job and your job abilities. Number 72. Somal. Starting with Somal, we're going to start seeing a lot more mixture in terms of what expansion we're discussing. Partially because we've actually covered most of the ARR dungeons already, But also, just in general, dungeon standards are going up, scores are going up, and the lower parts of the expansion are going to start filtering in more. Speaking of which, here's a dungeon you probably mostly forgot in Heaven's Ward. The ascent from Dravania is surprisingly underwhelming, no matter what the music is trying to tell you. What I think is the strength of this dungeon is, interestingly, in its trash. There's this through line of the fire and ice dragons that harass you as you fight other enemies. They fly down, you damage them, they fly away, and they come back wounded later on in the dungeon. That's kind of cool. I honestly wish more dungeons had a consideration for trash like that. But if only the bosses were as good as that. You get Discount Rafflesia, who's effectively a striking dummy and always was. The second boss was always simple, and now you can see whether it's markers or stack or spread, which makes it even easier and simpler. And Tiamat is the one you'll remember, but the various proximity comments dropped on players, the DPS check with the wings, I don't know. I don't know if it's just the pacing, but feeling it fresh for this ranking, it didn't feel that impactful. It's just, once again, we're tackling dragons again as a dungeon, something that we get so much of in Heaven's Ward. And it's just not selling it to me overall. It's trying. And again, love what they did with the trash in this place. But I think it's competing in a thematic that is super saturated and just not achieving much to score higher. People on this list still waiting for Aurum Vale to show up. Cecil said, you'd think the first boss, or the final boss, Nidhogg's Mate, would have been more of a spectacle. And then Oh My Song said, I forgot that was Nidhogg's Mate, which I think says a lot. Anyway, let's break open another worst of its expansion. This time with a dungeon you probably forgot. St. Mokian's Arboretum, Hard Mode. Stormblood's the next expansion to finally enter the mix, lasting a surprisingly long time for being the middle era of the game. But the Mud Dungeon, to me, deserves to be in the bottom 20. I love Mokian's, the original, but when you just wash out all the color of it and turn it to mud, it feels like a big downgrade here. Like, I use muddy as a discouraging word frequently, and now it's literally just mud. Also, the music is Dravania, but playing from a store across the abandoned mall, which is a choice that I like in a vacuum, but I don't think necessarily fits a dungeon. On all fronts presentationally, the Arboretum is my choice for the worst in Stormblood, because mud is just not an interesting identity. It does have stronger gameplay. You get the Nulchu, which is whatever. Lakamu does have some interesting stuff. As you can see right now, there's the mobs that you have to literally, like, water down or transform in order to weaken them over the course. And there is Tokapji, who is actually still a very dangerous boss that requires a little bit of communication between players, and I kind of like him. Still, all the good going on the gameplay side, to me, does not make up for the weakness on the presentational side. This, interestingly, by the way, was the last of the hard mode dungeons that ever happened. Given that even after like 2 expansions, they were still kind of underperforming a lot of the time, even if they'd gotten better, I can see why they were likely ditched in favor of just making singular, high-quality dungeons after this point. And to be honest, I think the only real loss was just the variety in expert roulettes. Yeah, I do see some people here that, like, specifically like what this place is. So maybe it is just, I just don't like what this place is. And that's going to happen quite a bit with a few things. And hey, like I said, if you don't like something, yell at me for it. Whether in the present or in the future as a YouTube comment. Number 70. the Dusk Vigil. The first dungeon of Heavensward was awesome at the time, but in retrospect I don't think is firing on all cylinders. Keyword is in retrospect here. Thematically, it's kind of the Stone Vigil pushed further. The dragons are just gone and instead replaced with a tragedy of starvation. And, like, that lore and the thematic in the zombie section in the middle is cool and gives this place a solid identity. But a lot of it is kind of just snow and random monsters for the sake of snow and random monsters. And that does hold the gameplay back to me, is that, like, the trash is mediocre, the bosses are pretty poor. Like, the Oliphant, his entire gimmick is this player doesn't get to play the game for like 15 seconds, everybody else just keeps fighting. And that's it, that's the only mechanic of the fight. The commander's an ad summoner fight, which is alright. Opinicus, the iconic griffin who does the statue break when he shows up, that's cool, but his like only mechanic of any note whatsoever is Whirl a Gale, which is kind of limiting. I will say, I love the atmosphere that's going on here, especially with the music. Like, I could probably have scored some of this higher, especially on the identity front, because it does a good job on that, but it still doesn't really grab me. I feel like there's just a lot of this dungeon that isn't living up to the potential it sets up for itself. Kuji said, Wings of Winter is also a mechanic, but it's so inconsequential that it's understandable on how forgettable it is. Yeah. I suppose technically you can dodge that attack, but like, you know, do you remember to, or do you just treat it as a raid wipe? Sage said, I figured this would rank lower, and oh, my song loves it. Yeah, this is a place. You're gonna remember it, but... Number 69, which dungeon is nice today? Sestasha, Hard Mode. You would think the revisit to a startlingly good base dungeon would be able to make massive improvements. And, like, technically it does, but also not as much as you would think. The biggest single improvement to me is just having music the entire time, delivering on Sestasha's theme in the way it deserves. You still get decent trash pulls, with the sirens and their approaching raid-wide bombs, or the final pirate just mass mobbing you with reinforcements. But the pace is much more structured and limited than the original, so it isn't solely an improvement. The bosses are still kind of lacking. Carlobos is a striking dummy until he decides to kill somebody who's not at full health, which means he's a striking dummy for everybody but the healer. Captain Madison's gunning gets interrupted by hitting him enough, something that I used to be in parties that had a problem with, and speaks to how much better players have gotten, but he's nothing now. And then we have Kraken 2, which is a better fight than the fight we'll be discussing soon, but, like, he's still pretty largely trivial these days because of just overgearing, making the damage check of the fight much simpler. Similarly, even though the visuals and identity are roughly the same, like, you get the cool looking lowering water segment, which is really memorable. But there's also just less visual variety overall in the middle section, since we go into just more cave instead of through the pirate den. And this return trip feels like it has less purpose or focus or anything really super unique to itself. Sestasha Hard is a better dungeon than Sestasha, but not in the major ways I think it could have been. And in watering down that original identity a little bit, I don't know. I still really like how it looks. It's just nice. Cecil said, I like that number 69 is a hard dungeon. Thank you. Sage said, haha, watering down, because Sestasha. I didn't even intend that. Okay. 68. Cutter's Cry. hear me out. It's hindered by being rather long and dry, and not just because it's in a desert, but I don't think it's the worst thing. The cavernous setting is given some visual variety thanks to the desert integrated into it, with spots like the oasis freshening it up. Even the final boss's area is surprisingly detailed with all the corpses around it. Shame it's lacking good music of its own. Each leg of the trash in Gunner's Cry comes with some danger of its own. I like the fact that you can do the whole skip the middle leg of the trash in the oasis if you know what you're doing and your party's on the same page. It's a bit of a shame there's too much of it. Also, despite the Myrmidon Princess kind of sucking, I do like that the Cutter's Cry has some good, tougher bosses for ARR. You get the Tunnel Worm, who's a little bit chaotic with dots and stuff, and then there's the Chimera, who might be an overused foe now, and we're literally going to see this as trash in other dungeons. But it's still the Chimera. Its voices require you to pay attention to the attack, you're getting chased around by orbs, there's ground AoEs limiting your movement, and it's punishing as hell if it hits you. It's a real wake-up call to players who have just been mindlessly wailing on bosses up to this point, and I respect the Chimera a lot. It's still an ARR dungeon at the end of the day. There's a bit too much trash going on, it's still got some boring bosses, and I named Tunnel Worm the best second boss of ARR, but it's still only scoring a 2. Still, I can like Cutter's Cry. I think you could do worse, especially at the level range it's at. Aubert said, not the worst, but I'd swap it with Hawkeye. Understandable. Flux says, I feel like this gets carried by its final boss. Not as much as you'd think, but I do enjoy it. Cecil said, second boss, 2 points, best of ARR. Yeah, ARR is not exactly winning in the boss fight category, let's be real. At least not launch ARR. Next up, let's head back to Heavensward for 67. The Pharos Sirius, hard. Flipping the Pharos' lighthouse around in progression, we start at the top and work our way down. And once we get there, the dungeon isn't over as we dive down into the mines the kobolds have dug out to thwart their attempts to take it over. And that's kind of where my issue actually is with Pharos Hard. I actually really like the original dungeon. You're going to be surprised how high it ends up on this list. But overwriting an entire segment of it with a new part that's just ugly caves we've seen before is just straight up a presentational downgrade to me. The trash is passable, with a lot of freedom to pull as big as you want, and the, ads that you have to kill quickly to avoid summoning reinforcements in the mines. I like the bosses, they're a little bit strange. The Luminary has weird mechanics. I like the idea of killing the jellies to patch up the holes that the second boss creates as he runs around. And there's Mom Bomb and Dad Bomb and the Baby Bombs in a fight that should be chaotic, but damage has gotten so high that none of the individual checks in the fight really matter for anything anymore, which is unfortunate and killed a lot of the fight's identity. Still, as much as all these scores are fine, you'll notice there's no zeros. To me, it just lost a lot of its original charm and purpose and is just down here. Most of its categories are a downgrade from the original to me. It just isn't good enough. Oh, my song said, it gave Pharos Sirius a backing beat. Yeah, it's got a little bit more of the music, but... Okay. 66. The Sunken Temple of Karn, hard mode. An unusually solid ARR dungeon on the gameplay and boss front. Karn, unfortunately, also suffers in some ways compared to the original, which we'll get into when we get there. It did gain a full music track, which is adventurous and maybe a little bit overdramatic, if I'm being honest. But compared to the strengths of the original Karn, this one lacks the standout aspects in favor of just being generally stronger. All three bosses share a feeling of being relatively chaotic. You get the Ruined Adjudicator, forces you out of areas with quicksand. You get the Sabotender Imperatrice, who I realized as I was writing the script is somehow still the only Cactuar boss fight in the entire game. Of course, none of those are the boss that people actually remember from here. The Vice Regent, with his marching zombies, laser blasts, angry harassment, like, all of those things actually make the Vice Regent one of the more memorable bosses of the 2.x series of patches, and just a lot of fun to fight. Once you escape the relative fun of the bosses, though, you don't get much. The Trash has some mildly fun encounters with, like, the big grabby hands dudes, but that's kind of it. The Karn was also never much of a looker of a location, and this revisit lacks the oomph for identity at all beyond its ruins and caves. Which, okay. I don't hate this place, but in true fashion of being the first dungeon whose average score is a 2 out of 5, it's fine, I guess. Oh, my song says, Quarn on the comm. Yep. Falcio said, I do like the fact that the Imperatrice has 100,000 needles. That is a fun little, like, gimmick to it, yeah. 65 is a big one. The Castrum Meridianum. If you have not played since this dungeon was overhauled, you are probably very confused. This basically got replaced with this whole new dungeon that's just reusing the same environment. And I'm not penalizing the cutscenes for this or the Praetorium. If you're in these dungeons, you know what you signed up for. The first of the 2 finale dungeons of ARR used to be an 8-man assault on the Garlean Fortress and also your patience. Now it's a little bit more standard. The visual design still isn't super impressive, but it's a welcome change of pace from the rest of ARR. You get, for the first time in the game, a unique music track that is honestly pretty nice. I like the tension in it. It's a little bit typical Garlean. We see a bunch of it, so it doesn't stand out too much, but it's solid presentationally, for ARR especially. The bosses also all got overhauled completely. Like, look at what they did to Livia. Look at Livia's AoE patterns. That is the most chaotic nonsense in a very long time in ARR. You also get, like, okay other bosses, which is a step up from how they were previously. It's not like this is the only Garlean base we'll be stomping through. But with the onus of being the start of the end of ARR hanging on its shoulders, and the overall much smoother experience it got, Castrum Meridianum is no longer awful to me. It's now firmly just kind of like, yeah, it's okay. That's a big improvement. Oh, my song said, slow Sid walk getting changed to Sid crashing through a wall is just design learning in a huge nutshell. Also, talk about a makeover. Yeah, this is maybe one of the biggest beneficiaries of the dungeon changes that has happened. Okay. Number 64. Hullbreaker Isle Hard Mode. What is with all these hard modes being worse than the originals? I didn't, like, plan for that. But I found that fascinating when I was scoring everything, how many I'm having to mention that about. Converted from its untouched island paradise into a maelstrom training ground, Hullbreaker kind of achieves what Hull-Atali attempted, making you feel like you're running a gauntlet at a coliseum. The visual updates are much more noticeable, with you traversing wooden pans and floating platforms, all adding flavor, and especially if you're an officer of the Maelstrom, then you get extra weight in the NPC commentary. We have okay boss fights. The Sirens are an ad rush, but there's a chaos to all the various AoE barrages coming out. Ymir comes in from the opening of FF6 to shock you pretty hard unless you're paying attention. And you do get to fight Mistbeard, a fight that is visually pretty understated, but comes with fun gimmicks like binding characters and making your healer cleanse them so they can escape AoEs. But that's where a lot of my praise comes to an end. Hullbreaker Heart has two big weak points holding it back, two worst ofs for Heavensward. The first is the really basic and near-featureless trash, which is really doubly disappointing when some of it is named characters that should be doing things. And the second is for the music track, which is fitting, but is honestly kind of boring. It doesn't really ever go anywhere. The place has a strong sense of identity, thanks to the Colosseum setup and execution being done well, a good look, some alright bosses, but it's held back from greater placements by its demerits. Flex said Gridanian Gauntlet when? Honestly, that's a really good question. I would happily throw hands with the Seed Seer, just for the sake of it. '63. It's time to break open Endwalker. Spoiler warning. The Lunar Subterrane, the game's most recent dungeon, places all the way down here in the bottom third of the list. So how does this port of FF4's final dungeon screw it up? What did it do to piss me off so much? It lied. You get one leg of the area it promises as a rendition of FF4's final dungeon, with an okay boss fight with the Dark Elf. And then it rug pulls you and drops you into Baron. And to be honest, I kinda hate that. The entirety of Baron is ugly to me, and the visual filter going on over it that is just like draining the color out does not do it for me at all. Also, the music for the Lunar Subterrane is supposed to be one of FF4's best tracks to me, and instead we get Baron's theme song, and just... like, listen, I'm still really mad at what we got robbed for here in favor of something that felt a lot more like stuff we had done before, aesthetically and design-wise. Now, what I will say is that in typical Endwalker fashion, the boss fights are great. I love the boss fights. Look at that, 444, the best bosses we have seen so far, because Endwalker does two things really well. It does awesome boss fights, and it does awesome visuals and presentation. But when, to me, a dungeon completely screws its presentation up, like even the first leg of it doesn't look that good, it's really drained of style to me. Like, two worst of Endwalkers, barely any points in those categories. We're at 15 out of 35 in terms of score. This is still just barely falling into the bottom third of the dungeons, but this is my take for my least favorite dungeon in Endwalker. Aubert said, I think not having played 4 was to my benefit here, because I hard disagree. So the worst part is this is still a nostalgia dungeon. They just completely uproot where the nostalgia is going. And I don't think what they replaced it with stands on its own is strong enough. But... yeah, I don't know. This one's personal. Here's one that will probably be less spicy. Number 62. The Drowned City of Scala. In contrast to the previous dungeon's big highs and aggravating lows, Scala's just mediocre. It's a cool idea, diving into a city lost beneath a lake in order to search for the missing treasure of an Alamegan dynasty. Does it achieve it? Nothing really sells the idea aside from the treasure room at the very end, and the dungeon loses its interesting scenery early on to go kind of just generic. Even the music doesn't feel like it's really feeling it today. It's fine and functional, but honestly really relaxed for what it is. The bosses aren't too bad. I like the Kelpie's push and pull, and I kind of miss when the names were backwards and it screwed with people. I like the transformation gimmick of the old one and using the bombs to destroy his ads. That's cute. Heraldric Poison Tongue. Big, imposing, uses big attacks, sure. He's alright. Like, I don't actually have any major issues with Heraldric, but while the bosses are functional, Scala does have a big weakness in having a really boring trash pull-to-pull. Like, other than the destructible walls in the first segments, it's all completely standard and structured, and that isn't anything worth talking about. It's Stormblood's worth showing on that front. Scala is a bunch of okay pieces that don't really stand out on their own, put together in a way that doesn't really add to each other to me. I don't hate being here, but I'd be surprised if anybody would say this is their favorite. Aubert said, another forgettable one until I go here and it seems okay, then it's forgotten it again. Exactly. What would you say would improve the scenery? I want the, like, sunken city aesthetic to feel like it's rolling through the entire thing, I guess? But yeah. Oh My Song said, I think Stormblood has the best environmental design of any expect, and the world feels very alive, the vibes are great. Largely, I agree. Which I think is why Scala is kind of not doing it for me. Even though there are, like, a bunch of details here, like, I just forget this place. But, we're now at the end of this third section. So here's number 61. The last dungeon that falls into this lower category. Somal Hard. Sorry, I had to clear my throat. Easily one of the most transformative hard mode dungeons. Somal Hard is technically the original in reverse, but with the heavy use of the different palettes of each area, the completely different vibe, the absolute rock track that is backing it now, you'd be forgiven for not recognizing it's the original. It still sort of lacks a really standout factor, other than the music. But yeah. Unfortunately, its gameplay side is still not super impressive. As opposed to the really cool trash stuff done with the original with its harassing dragons, the hard mode revisit has relatively normal trash, but mildly stronger bosses. Legally distinct Bulbasaur and legally distinct Feraligatr are alright, but not as impressive as some bosses that we've seen before. The Lava Scorpion at the end is a bunch of really cool ideas, with the AoEs slowly spreading to cover more and more of the platform. Unfortunately, this is one of those mechanics that doesn't survive overgearing and power creep that well. Somal Hard doesn't have any major weak spots to me, but it's also lacking enough strengths to carry it any higher than a 15. It's fine. It's just fine, and it is an improvement as a hard mode, which a lot of the hard modes apparently cannot claim. But it still ends up just barely rounding out the bottom tier as our 61st entry. Oh My Song said, I don't disagree with it being neutral, but it does have things to add to the corkboard. Yeah. That might have been about the previous dungeon. Aubert said pretty neutral. Cecil said definitely average. Sage said, I think this is a weaker choice that's carried by its final boss. Yeah, fair enough. Okay. We're now a third of the way through the list. So, like, take a moment to grab a drink before the next video while I change over to the new file and prep a whole new video. Seriously, the PowerPoint I made for this ended up being so massive, I decided to cut it into 3 just to make it not take 10 years to save a load. Also, because I really need a drink and stuff after all this talking I've done. And frankly, so should you. Go head up the washroom, go take care of your body, go stretch, and I'll see you for part 2.